Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Have History Will Travel. I am your host, the Wilder Historian, and I am finishing up Hill's actions at the Battle of Chancellorsville by describing the wounding of Jackson and Hill's role during that chaotic friendly fire situation. I will be quoting heavily from James I. Robertson's book on A.P. Hill and Jackson describing the situation, simply because I don't think anyone does it better than Robertson depicting the chaos and the detail. Jackson then rode to find the Federal line in the darkness. Hill was doing the same. Hill's chief engineer accidentally rode into a Union battery and was captured. Now, both Jackson and Hill met up as they made their way back to the Confederate lines to send their men forward. The sharp crack of a musket broke the silence. Then a volley of rifle fire from nervous Southerners rolled through the woods. Confederate musketry triggered Union artillery, and a salvo of shells ripped through the trees and ricocheted up the road. The group of the two generals and their staff numbered nearly 20 men. To one North Carolinian, the sound of the group sounded like a brigade of cavalry running at a rapid gait. Hill got to within 20 yards of Lane's brigade, trying to clear a path for the party to move through. He yelled for the North Carolinians to stop firing. Captain Alfred Toller of the 18th North Carolina yelled that it was a lie and to pour it into them. When the Confederate volley hit the group of horsemen, the party ceased to exist. Amid a turmoil of anguished shrieks, piercing cries, men falling to the ground, other riders reeling in the saddle as mounts bolted in every direction. Hill miraculously had not been hit and immediately dismounted and lay face down on the ground for a few seconds. He then remounted hastily and rode toward Lane's position with a cry half in anger and half in shock. "You have shot my friends. You have destroyed my staff." He came up to one of his favorite aides, 19-year-old Captain Murray Forbes Taylor, who was pinned beneath his dead horse. Hill was in the process of extricating Taylor when a courier dashed up and announced in a trembling voice that Jackson lay seriously wounded some 50 yards away. "Help yourself," Hill said to the half-freed Taylor. "I must go to General Jackson." Then, as an afterthought, Hill stated in a hushed voice, "Don't tell the troops about the general." Hill raced over to the base of a pine tree where Jackson was laying. He told the bleeding general that he was trying to get the men to stop firing, and then asked if the wound was painful. "Very painful," Jackson replied. "I think my arm is broken." Hill carefully removed Jackson's gauntlets, which were blood-soaked. Then he took off the general's saber and belt. Next, in a characteristic display of compassion, Hill sat down on the ground and cradled Jackson's head in his lap while he gently tore open Jackson's left sleeve and tried with handkerchiefs to stem the hemorrhaging. Captain Adams bent over and offered his flask of brandy. The pious Jackson hesitated, then drank a small swallow. Dr. Richard Barr, an assistant surgeon in Pender's brigade, made his way to the men, led there by Captain Benjamin Lee. Jackson whispered to Hill, "Is he a good surgeon?" Hill replied that he stood in high regard in the brigade for his ability and assured him that nothing drastic would be done until Dr. McGuire, Jackson's personal physician, arrived. The battle lines were now intermingling as each side tried to determine where the other was. Hill looked up and saw two Union soldiers a few yards away. Hill softly told two of his orderlies to arrest the enemy soldiers. The two men dropped their weapons without resistance. Hill eased out from under the general. "I will try to keep your accident from the knowledge of the troops," he said. "Thank you," Jackson replied. Hill, knowing he was now temporarily in charge of Jackson's corps, proceeded on foot, with pistol drawn, to Heath's position to make sure his battle lines were stable and superintend the brigades. He then turned to go back to where Jackson lay when a quick burst of artillery fire came from across the way. Searing pain shot across the back of his legs below the knee. A shell fragment had ripped off the top of his boots. Hill reached down to feel for blood. He could detect none, yet both legs were so numb that he could barely stand. He limped for a few steps, but the pain in one leg forced him to sit down on a stump of a large oak. Upon removing the boot, he saw blood on the underclothing. Hill slowly mounted his horse. He rode to the front, one foot sticking out from the stirrup. A member of Hill's staff rode up to him and asked if he was wounded. Hill replied, "Yes, I have been shot in the calf of the leg. I fear the wound is serious enough to incapacitate me from continuing in command." Hill remained in the saddle while his staff went in search of Stewart. Sometime near 10:30, Stewart made it to Hill's position, and Hill formally turned over command of his corps to Stewart. Hill then proceeded to the rear on a litter. The next day, as Stewart was directing the attacks against the Union lines, Hill would be present in case Stewart needed help or if he could be of service positioning troops. Stuart explained that he was grateful to Hill for his help and presence on the battlefield. Hill had to ride in an ambulance to the various locations on the battlefield, and his limited mobility prevented him from traveling at a rapid pace. On May 6th, Hill asked Lee to be put back in command of the corps, which Lee granted, and Stuart went back to his cavalry. Out of Lee's 12,000 casualties, 416 of the dead and 2,171 of the wounded were in Hill's division. It was a great victory over the numerically superior Army of the Potomac, but it came at a horrible cost. Jackson's arm had to be amputated and pneumonia set in. In Jackson's delirium, he called for Hill and his division and would pass away on May 10th. With Jackson gone, Lee needed to replace him. Jackson's staff criticized A.P. Hill. Jackson's mapmaker, Jed Hotchkiss, told his wife that Hill was a good military leader, but he was not a man of God and did not wear the sword of the Lord and of Gideon. Dorsey Pender hoped that Hill would take Jackson's place because, as he said, "I hope to stick to him, for he sticks with me." Lee had 6 candidates in the run-in to succeed Jackson: A.P. Hill, Richard Ewell, D.H. Hill, Richard Anderson, Lafayette McLaws, and John Bell Hood. Hill was the front-runner. Lee told Jefferson Davis, "I think upon the whole, Hill is the best soldier of his grade with me." Ewell was also highly considered. For one reason, he had been closest to Jackson, starting with the 1862 Valley Campaign. He had lost a leg at Groveton in August and was now able to walk. Many people viewed Ewell as Jackson's natural successor because of his closeness to Jackson. On May 23rd, Ewell was named commander of the 2nd Corps. The next day, Lee called Hill to his headquarters. They started a friendly conversation, then Lee got to the point. He expressed that having just 2 corps had become unwieldy, and that he was organizing the army into 3 corps, and Hill would command the 3rd. Longstreet and Porter Alexander complained that other field officers were more qualified and that Hill had been chosen primarily because he was a Virginian. Davis wrote a letter after the war stating, "There had been complaints in certain quarters that Virginia was getting more than her fair share of the promotions, but in truth was that A.P. Hill was so clearly entitled to the place, both on account of his ability as a soldier and the meritorious services he had rendered, that General Lee did not hesitate to recommend him, and I did not hesitate to make the appointment." On the day after his promotion, an official report came across Hill's desk stating that the 58th Virginia had lost its colors after hastily retreating after heavy losses. They requested to be given another flag, but Hill refused, saying they would only get a new flag when they captured an enemy flag. One of Hill's biographers stated, "Such concern over regimental behavior was the stuff of which excellent brigadiers and fighting division commanders were made. Lieutenant generals in charge of corps had of necessity to focus on the bigger picture. They were expected to give more attention to planning and organization, with correspondingly less involvement in combat leadership. Hill would never quite master that transition."